Welcome to the Bible and the Trinity in Conflict, Part 9. It's a series I decided I would do. In addition to other videos that I had already done that discuss some of the same or related issues, because it's a good way for us to focus on what is an important subject for many people, and even if you don't believe in the Trinity, and it's important to you because of that reason, then you're still going to be involved with the Trinity if you're at all involved with Christian history and the meaning and understanding of Christian texts. So, even if the Trinity isn't something you believe is true, it's nonetheless an important belief for many, and because it comes up so frequently as a point of discussion, even if you don't believe it. And we've been talking about how the Bible is very clear when it comes to things like how many persons God is. Galatians 3:20. God is one. He is one. In addition to saying God and one, it actually uses the singular verb he, showing God as one person. We also discussed the meaning of the term God and gods in the specific context of John 10, in which the Jews accused him of being theos, a god. We know that because Jesus, in responding to the accusation, quoted a text, Psalm 82, that refers to other sons of God as gods, in the plural. That's what Jesus used. And that's what we use too, to show that the term God can have more than one application without creating a situation that we cannot resolve. We know there's one God the Father, 1 Corinthians 8:6. Trinitarians might agree with that, but then add this, one God the Son and one God the Holy Spirit. And that's not in the text. And so this is where we get into conflict. And so now we're in the letter to the Hebrews. We've completed our review of chapter 1. I encourage you to watch the videos in this series, and specifically in the Hebrews 1 series, to get up to speed on where we are now, which is in Hebrews chapter 2. We're going to be reading verses 5 through 11 tonight. Then in part 10 of this series, we're going to read verses 12 through 18, finish up chapter 2, because there's relevant material there, as you will see, if you have not already. But we're going to review it together in a way that I think will be better, because where two or three are gathered, there he is. And so in a Christian sense, it's very important for us to come together like this in a way that helps us become more understanding of what we're doing, what we believe. And even if we already know these things in most of the important ways, again, because people believe differently where it concerns things like the Trinity, there are elements of belief that become difficult, complicated, right? Because you're trying to figure out where's this person coming from using these same texts. Why are we not coming up to the same view in so many instances? What's happening? What's blocking this united appreciation and presentation of these texts? There's something. But so far, when we've been considering this material, it's looked pretty clear just when we look at the text, the quotations that are made, their application, the sequence that is made, it starts to become more clear. And that's why I always encourage people, and why I myself try to look at the text first, if not exclusively. We only need so many interpretations, if any, of these texts. For the most part, they're fairly clear. Their translation is not really an issue in most respects. There are some where we have a contest, But even those can be resolved, and I believe they have been. That doesn't mean that everyone agrees when it comes to how they were resolved. But that's something you can review and determine for yourself. And then we go on. We continue to evaluate the material to make sure that we completely understand it, and we can share our understanding with new people, so that when they get to these difficult texts or more difficult texts that involve other texts, some of which read differently, like we've read about in our reading of Hebrews 1, specifically verse 10, it's a difference that we can isolate and recognize and understand why in the proper context, and then continue to make sense of the way it's used in this text, Hebrews 1 or 2. Right? So just because the Christians and the Jews didn't always agree when it came to the text that they were using or applying to people like Jesus, it doesn't mean that those texts don't apply, or that the application made, for example, in Hebrews 1:10 is not consistent with everything else that we've read. And it was. And that's what we look for. We want to understand the text. We want to make sure it makes sense. And then does it fit with everything else, right? And so far it does. So we've learned a lot when it comes to Jesus. We've seen how the author of Hebrews speaks about him being the one through whom God made the ages. How he also was the one who put things together. Right? How the heavens and the earth were the works of his hands in that way, because he was with the Father at that exact time when those things were made. We learned about how the Son became better than the angels after he became lower than the angels and gave his life faithful, unlike any of those angels, so much so that he was raised to the Father's right hand, given a name better than those angels, and then he was put on God's throne, enthroned by God, messianic texts applied, none of which were applied to any angelic servants of God, spirits, ministering spirits, as they're described. But they are applied to the Son, the one who lowered himself below what the angels are, as we're going to find out more in our reading tonight, and then became better because of his new name. Just like we read in Philippians 2, where God gave him the name above every name, which we are told in Revelation is the Logos of God. Revelation 19:13, we talked about it in part 3 of this series, Philippians 2, 9 through 11. But in that name, while every knee in heaven and on earth bows, it is not to the one who has that name or who's given that name. It's something God allows. Let all God's angels worship him, to the glory of God the Father. That's because, as we discussed in our last text reading in Exodus chapter 7, where it says that Jah made Moses God to Pharaoh, we talked about how that would be even more so appropriate and the case with Jesus, the last Adam, as a man, right? Just like Moses says in Exodus chapter 7, or God says to him, you'll be God to Pharaoh because you're going to say all that I tell you to say to him. That's the same thing with Jesus over and over again in the New Testament. And so not only would it be more so the case with him, but as a spirit, because spirits more so represent God, as we see in the Old Testament, than a man like Moses or even the last Adam, because they're spirits. Just like Jesus was raised to life according to 1 Corinthians 15:45. But he was raised to life to the right hand of God, according to Hebrews 1, 3, 4, the character imprint of God's being, the outshining of his glory, the firstborn. He was raised to the right hand and then enthroned by God, his God, and anointed more than his partners, becoming better than the angels because of his position, not because of his nature. It says explicitly because of his name he became better. He's a spirit just like those angels, but those angels, before he became a man, which may have included him during the time in the Hebrew Scriptures, but either way, they're servants as angels. Their nature is spirits. Their function is a messenger, a servant. Just like Jesus was before God enthroned him and allowed him to sit on his throne, which is where Jesus says, according to Revelation chapters 2 and 3, those who are raised to life with him will be able to sit and rule from the Father's throne. And so in this way, we are told repeatedly by the author of Hebrews, making these applications from all of these texts that relate to the Messiah becoming king, receiving authority from God to rule at his right hand and on God's throne. These applications to him since the time of his resurrection show his position and how he's better than the angels. And our reading tonight's going to do something similar, but it's going to reinforce how before Jesus became better, he was lower. And yet the Trinity would have us believe that even though Jesus became a man, he never stopped being God. Trinitarians maintain, and will consider you a heretic if you don't maintain, that Jesus never stopped being God. Ever. Let's find out if that's the case. I'll bring up our reading. We're going to be using the New World Translation tonight, and I've reviewed it. I'm familiar with it. If you have a legitimate criticism you want to bring up, go for it. If not, follow along in your own text, or you can read with me right now. Hebrews chapter 2. So with that in mind, I tried to kind of bring everyone up to speed a little bit, put to the front of our, understanding of these texts, the things we've read most recently, including from our day text, as it does apply, right? Because the Father is the one, according to Hebrews 1, who gives the Son this new name and position, who lets the angels bow before him. Because it's to his glory, as Paul also describes in Philippians 2, talking about the same thing, just in a little bit different sequence and with slightly different words. So now we're in Hebrews 2. We're carrying forward that understanding from Hebrews 1 and the first part of Hebrews 2. And so let's get to it. Verse 5, for it is not to angels that he has subjected the inhabited earth to come, about which we are speaking. But a certain witness has given proof somewhere, saying, what is man that you keep him in mind? Or the Son of Man that you take care of him? Verse 7, you made him a little lower than angels. With glory and honor you crowned him, and appointed him over the works of your hands. So he's talking about man, quoting from Psalm 8, which we'll get to further in a moment. But he's talking about first the fact that the earth has not been made subject to angels. And then he's talking about, from the Hebrew Scriptures, Psalm 8, how it is said, what is man, you keep him in mind, speaking to God in comparison to man, the Son of Man that you take care of. What are we in comparison to you? Why do you even concern yourself with us, so to speak, poetically, in glorifying God in the Psalms? Is how it comes out. And then he goes on to quote the rest of it, verse 7, you made him a little lower than angels. Where in the Hebrew text it says Elohim, God or gods. But the author of Hebrews is accepting the translation found in the Septuagint, in which we do often find angels used when translating Elohim, or the terms for God or gods, when that's how it's understood, as it is here. So the author of Hebrews is quoting that text in Psalm 8 that we'll get to in a moment, and stating that God made humans, which is what Psalm 8 describes, as we'll see, lower than angels. And then it goes on to quote the rest of the psalm, which we'll get to. Continues here, and then after finishing that part of the quote in verse 8, all things you subjected under his, that is man's feet. He says, for in that he subjected all things to him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. God is in brackets there because it's the understood subject from the psalm. The one who's making man lower than the angels. And in comparison to whom the psalmist is like, who are we? And then he says, now though, we do not yet see all things in subjection to him. Man, right? We don't have everything in subjection to us. We can, right? But it's sort of not in the way that we were originally made to have things in subjection to us according to God's purpose. And so he says, we don't see that right now. At the end of verse 8. But we do behold Jesus, verse 9, who has been made a little lower than angels, right? So now he's applying that same psalm we're going to get to in a minute to Jesus that he just applied to man, the Son of Man, verse 6. And then he says, you made him a little lower than angels. With glory and honor you crowned him, right? Just like in verse 7. Same thing. That he, by God's undeserved kindness, now referring back to Jesus here in verse 9, might taste death for every man. Okay? So far it seems pretty clear, does it not? That God didn't subject the earth originally to angels. He subjected it to humans, whom he made lower than angels, gods, according to the Hebrew text. He made him lower than those angelic gods, but crowned him with glory and honor, appointed him over the works of his hands, right? All things have in subjection, all things, just like Genesis says. And then at the end of verse 8, he says, but we don't see that. But then he says, but we do behold Jesus, who has been, right, in the past, made lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor, for having suffered death. All right, so while humans weren't ultimately able to fulfill the subjugation of the earth the way God intended, and the way that the author of Hebrews is applying Psalm 8 to humans here, according to the original text in Psalm 8, again, we'll read it in a moment. He says, well, while that didn't happen, right at the end of verse 8, we do have this. So he's getting around to the fact that what? That while it didn't happen with humans, it did happen with Jesus. How? He was made lower than the angels, just like us. What text does that remind you of? What other texts? What text can you think of that remind you of Jesus being made lower than the angels? Excuse me. Little hydration drink, right? John 1:14. Word became flesh. What was he before that? In the beginning with God. A spirit, right? Job 38:7. All the sons of God shouted in applause. Who's Jesus? He's the Son of God. Shouted in applause. Also putting things together there with Jehovah. So while humans did not subjugate the earth the way they were originally set in place to do, we do have Jesus who became the same as us, right? In addition to John 1:14, the Word became flesh, after stating he was in the beginning with God, right? That's the same thing, right? Becoming lower. He's being made lower, right? We were originally made that way. He came from heaven to the earth. Right? That's the whole point of John 1:1 and the rest of the prologue, as we'll get to in this series. And then in Philippians 2, right? It says the same thing. He was in the form of a God and then emptied himself, took on the form of a slave, became a man. We're going to talk about that verse extensively coming up in the next several videos on this series. And then we also have it in Hebrews 1. Right? He was the character of God's being, outshine of his glory. And that could apply to both his original creation as the firstborn, beginning of God's creation, and his resurrection, right? Because he's still the outshine of God's glory in that way. Although he may have become better in his post-resurrection sense. But either way, he still looks similar when you compare Revelation to Daniel. And the fact is that he goes from being described as that in Hebrews 1 to making a purification for our sins, becoming a man and dying, after which he was raised to the right hand of the Father. They're all talking about the same thing. All of them. Hebrews 2, same thing. We behold Jesus. He became lower than the angels, just like God made us lower than the angels. But he actually was able to suffer death in a different way than the death that we have. Nevertheless, verse 10, for it was fitting. Right? Why did he do this? Why did he? We know he did it for tasting death, right? Purifies for our sins. Hebrews 1, 3, and 4. We read it. We know, according to verse 9, he tasted death for every human. He paid the ransom, last Adam, 1 Corinthians 15:45. The seed, the remedy to the problem of making all these bad choices. He says it was fitting for the one whose sake all things are and through whom all things are. Who's he talking about? In bringing many sons to glory, to make the chief agent of their salvation perfect through sufferings. Right? So he's actually, according to this text, God, that is, the one who, it says, for whose sake all things are and through whom all things are. In both cases, it uses the preposition dia. Like you see in 1 Corinthians 8:6, in comparison to the Father as the one out of whom all things are, ek. And it says Jesus is the one through whom all things are, dia. Well, Hebrews 2:10 is one of the instances where dia, in both the accusative and genitive cases, are used of God. So what does that mean? Let me share a quote with you from the Bauer, Arndt, Danker, Gingrich lexicon, well known and available. And I'm just going to read a little bit. There's an extensive discussion of the preposition dia and its uses in the New Testament. And you can look at other lexicons as well. It has a number of different uses, and some of them are exclusive to specific cases, but it has also sort of a core element that I'm going to read to you about in just a second. And then I think you'll see why it's applicable to God in this context. So let me read it. This is from page 223, under dia, the very first paragraph. Dia, preposition with genitive and accusative. The fundamental idea that finds expression in this preposition is separation, especially in the genitive, with the generic sense through. In the accusative, the generic sense also is through, but primarily with a causal focus, owing to. Let me repeat that. It talks about how the fundamental idea finds expression in the preposition is separation, a generic sense of through, in both the accusative and the genitive, but primarily with a causal focus, owing to. Now, I've written more about the use of these prepositions, and specifically in this text and in others, related to God and Jesus. So I encourage you to look at my defended editions for more on that subject. You can just look up this text and it will take you to the others as well. But I wanted to add that part of the Bauer and Gingrich Danker lexicon's definition, or preface part to their definitions of dia, uses of dia, so that you understand the causal focus of dia and its uses in both the genitive and accusative, that allow for really this understanding of it's due to or owing to someone. Now, in 1 Corinthians 8:6, the contrast is so obvious and intentional, right? It's the whole point of what Paul's saying here. One God the Father, out of whom all things are, ek. One Lord Jesus, through whom all things are, dia. And with Jesus never having ek used of him in that same way, so that you could say that they're just different ways of referring to the same thing. They're not. That's obvious from 1 Corinthians 8:6 and from the descriptions of Jesus as God's firstborn, the beginning of the creation, the fact that all things are made through, God creates them through or in him, right? So there's an active sense in which the Father is creating through or using the Son in ways like putting things together, carpenter's son analogy, metaphysical, so it's hard to fully detail. But you see where it goes and how it fits all together with this concept of the carpenter's son, what a set of wisdom, the different descriptions of Jesus in the New Testament, Colossians 1, John 1, text we'll get to later, but that I referenced because they show the Father's the one doing that work. The Son's involved, but not in an active sense in the way that the Father is, not in the as the source, the one from whom all things are, out of whom all things are. He's the one through whom, and the one that God creates through as the passive agent, in that sense different from him. Whereas God can also be viewed with the causal sense, the owing to force or focus of dia. And notice it uses both the genitive and accusative uses of dia in a way that isn't making a comparison with anybody, right? So that it's a doubling up of the usage of that preposition in a way meant to emphasize the causal focus. That, and it's not really referring necessarily to creation, but the whole process, right, of what? Bringing many sons to glory. And so this is the causal nature, the owing to being attributed to the Father, to God here. It was fitting for the one whose sake all things are, and through whom all things are, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the chief agent of their salvation perfect through sufferings. So it certainly could be a reference or an inclusion of creation, right? As with God as the causal, the one that all things owe their existence to, in the sense that we read from the Bauer, Arndt, Danker, and Gingrich lexicon. So there's nothing inconsistent with that. If all things are owing to the Father that exist, and they're all for his sake, they're all owing to him in that way, they're all because of him. And if that goes even further to include the whole process, for example, from the time of the Garden of Eden, to bring all of these sons to glory, right? So that could be a reference to everything that's involved and everything that was created. And so you see again this doubling up of the dia preposition with the causal nature, owing to a focus, I believe, being made clear, because it relates specifically to making the chief agent of their, right, the sons to glory. That's us, right? That's all Christians who follow in the path that the Son made for us. It's talking about the one that made the Son the chief agent of our salvation through these sufferings, right? So Jesus became lower than the angels, right? Just like humans. We'll get to Psalm 8 in a minute, as soon as we finish this reading, but I want to make sure we understand it. And then we go to Psalm 8, we'll see how it compares. So he's making that application, quoting Psalm 8, showing that humans were made lower than angels, right? According to the Hebrew text, lower than gods. And then he says, well, we don't see it, right? We don't see that now that's the case, but we do see Jesus. We behold him as the one who has been made lower than the angels. Then he suffered and died, right? And then he tasted death for every human. And then we get in verse 10 that reference we just discussed with God as the one attributed, to whom is attributed the causal owing to of all things that are, and for whose sake all things are in that way owed to. So it's not referring to the Father, what I'm saying, and in discussing Dia in this way, it's not referring to him in an intermediary sense, right? We don't have the Son here creating through the Father. We don't have someone else being spoken of as doing something through the Father. We have the Father, the one who's responsible for making the chief agent of our salvation perfect, being the one to whom is attributed all things being in existence and being owed to him for that reason. And that fits with that kind of focus and causal nature of Dia. So it's not always this intermediary sense. It never has always been that. No one has said that. So when Trinitarians highlight this text, we've never said there isn't another sense in which Dia in the genitive or Dia with the accusative, not Dia in the genitive, but it's with another term in a case like the genitive or accusative. And either one, they both apply to the Father appropriately in this text for the reasons we just discussed, and they don't conflict at all with what is taught elsewhere with Jesus as the intermediary and the Father as the source. And that doesn't mean Jesus isn't active. We already know he puts things together and he's been active according to Proverbs and other texts that show, and his being made the carpenter's son, I believe an obvious parallel there. John knew the role to best put his son, the one he already had. But there's also a passive sense in which he is acted upon and in which the Father does his work. Even as a man, right, he says that, John 14:10, the Father's in me doing his works. This is his stuff, right? I'm just being used by him. These aren't my words, these aren't my teaching, it's him. That's how it is also in the creation, where Jesus is involved, right? He's talking, he's still doing things. But it's the Father who's directing it all, doing the creating or the speaking through the Son. And so, don't allow anyone to confuse you with the use of Dia in this text or in Romans 11:36. Another instance where I believe Dia is used of the Father. But again, you just have to know and be able to explain that some of these prepositions have more than one meaning. Most of them do, if not all. And in this case, the meanings can be explained so that there's no contradiction with the roles otherwise and elsewhere made plain of the Father and the Son, including Hebrews 1, right? Where God makes through the Son in the way that is not stated here with anyone making through God, the one who brings the sons to glory and perfects the chief agent of our salvation. See what I'm saying? This is a different context, different way of speaking about the subject or another in relation to this preposition and the activity it relates to. Not the same, both in terms of the meaning of the preposition and the context in which these statements are made. All right, last text, and then we'll talk further about it. Verse 11, for he who is sanctifying and those who are being sanctified all stem from one, or according to the Greek, are all out of one. And for this cause he is not ashamed to call them brothers. All right. So as I was just talking about, again, only the Father, only God the Father, in obvious distinction to Jesus or the Son, like we see here, is the one from whom, right here, is the preposition ek again. And in fact, in this text, and I believe you could also make the case for 1 Corinthians 8:6, it being the case that Jesus is out of the Father, right? All things. Trinitarians want to say all things, right? That includes Jesus then. And as the firstborn, that would make sense, right? And it says right here in Hebrews 2:10, it was fitting, Hebrews 2:11, for he who is sanctifying and those who are being sanctified all stem from one. Right? So Jesus is the one who sanctifies us, right? He's the chief agent of our salvation. He sanctifies us in that way, having himself been made perfect through sufferings. So we see that made plain right here. And then he says, both he who is sanctifying and the sons that are referred to in verse 10, right here. Both he who is sanctifying, the chief agent, and those who are being sanctified all stem from one. They're all out of one. Now, just as I explained in relation to Hebrews 2:10 and the preposition dia in the genitive and accusative used with the genitive and accusative used for God, and how that could include the creative activity, right? The one for whose sake all things are and through whom all things are. And the reason I qualified is only because in the context here, we're getting statements that contextually are applied to this process related to our salvation, and that make some of these texts that seem to relate to creation just a little difficult to make that 100% or fairly certain. We get something similar in Hebrews 3, as you'll see later in our subsequent videos. But so I just make a little qualification for things like verse 10. Whether or not it applies to the creation or not doesn't change what I said about dia and its use with the genitive or accusative in the ways having to do with the causal focus or owing to, due to, right? Not an intermediary usage, instrumental usage like we see with Jesus in relation to the Father. Whether it's in relation to the creation of this whole process of salvation and bringing sons to glory, it doesn't change that. It's just not so clear. So if we do take verse 10 in reference to creation, then when we get to verse 11, I'm kind of looking out for Trinitarians here a little bit. You'll see why. So if in verse 11 it says, all are from one, all out of one. Ex henos pantes. Out of one, all. That includes the Son. It says so right here. Both he who is sanctifying and those who are being sanctified. All from one. Out of one, all. I believe this text explicitly, especially if we take verse 10 and the all things, one for whose sake all things are and through whom all things are. I don't see how we could then deny that in verse 11, the fact that the one sanctifying and those being sanctified, the chief agent, and those who attain salvation through him, are referred to in verse 11 as all being out of one. The same one that in verse 10 it says, for whose sake all things are, and through whom all things are. And in verse 11 it then says they're out of him, all, just like 1 Corinthians 8:6. So, that's going beyond just the human creation of Jesus, right? Because if verse 10 is talking about all things and their creation, right, all the way back to the beginning, then I think verse 11 is also. And the addition of stem in the NWT is not necessary. I guess it could be still used and made sense of, but it should be made more plain that they're all out of one. Especially given the relationship to verse 10, if that's to the creation, as it probably is, but, it may not be, and we have a little more to go. And so there's a kind of a sense in the letter of Hebrews where a lot of texts may or may not be exactly what they say. So, nevertheless, it does say they're all out of one. Just like 1 Corinthians 8:6, and here referring to the Son and those who are sanctified through him. So, let's go to Psalm 8. The text really that is the basis for what we're reading in Hebrews 2 in our reading this evening. Psalm 8, let's just go look at it, since we've been referencing it several times, and see the context in which it's applied. And many of us are familiar with this text because in talking with Trinitarians, what we often will do next is refer to this text. Now we're starting, I think, to use John 10 and Psalm 82 more, as we should. That's what Jesus used, right? I mean, you can't beat that. But we have in the past and still do, people by you and we, I mean me and you, people who don't believe in the Trinity, and when we talk with Trinitarians, we'll use this text because it shows that angels can be called God. Just like we read about with Moses in Exodus 7, he's made God, Elohim, Theos to Pharaoh, and that's specifically qualified by him saying only what God tells him to say, just like the angels. Right? That's what they do. That's the whole point of being the ministering servants of Hebrews 1. Right? And that's what the Son came and did as well, right? But as a man. And he became lower than the angels, like we just read. He still was doing the same thing, though, like with Moses in that role. And that's why it says in Hebrews 2, he became lower than the angels. And that's why in Hebrews 1 and Philippians 2, it talks about how after he died, he became better than the angels. He couldn't have been better while he was on earth because he was made lower than them while he was on earth. It says so right here, or in the application of this text that we just read, right? Well, here's the text. Psalm 8:5. You, the psalmist speaking to Jehovah, right? Verse 1, O Jehovah our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. We agree. He's talking about contrasting mortal man with the works of the heavens, like we read about in Hebrews 1, right? What is it that makes you think of us, right? Of course, we know we're made in his image, but still in comparison, right? This whole point of the psalm. Glorify Jah. Rest of the quotation, you proceed to make him a little less than godlike ones. It's really the Hebrew text Elohim. Greek text is the term for angels, angelos in the plural. As in Hebrews chapter 2, the quotation in verse 7 and 9, right? First to the humans and then to Jesus, the humans who were made lower than the angels, is right here we're reading in Psalm 8. But we haven't become the masters the way we were intended. We were originally made that way. That's what he's talking about, right? You made man less than godlike ones, less than gods, angels, just like we're reading in Hebrews, quoting from the Psalm. Then it says, and with glory and splendor you crowned him. You make him dominate over the works of your hands, everything you have put under his feet. And then he goes on to describe things further and to praise Jehovah. And so we know that while that continued in some way and still does, right? Originally in the way it was intended, the ground was cursed, the earth was cursed. Our relationship is not the same with the animals or with each other, We don't have the subjugation of the earth the way it was intended. That's the whole point of what we read about in Hebrews 2. So very clearly, though, we're dealing here with humans. The context in which God made them lower than the angels or the spirit gods who serve him. So back to Hebrews 2. Before we wrap things up, thank you all for joining me this evening. We'll be doing another video this weekend, and we'll get back to our Bible and the Trinity series here pretty quickly, so we can wrap up Hebrews 2 and get into Hebrews 3 before we turn back to Philippians 2. On our way to John 1, right? So, Hebrews 2. Let's put everyone back here again in terms of our reading. Let's just look at this one more time. I think it made perfect sense, don't you? Now that we just read Psalm 8, the quotation that was made, and having talked about the way that these prepositions are used, the distinctions that are made between God and Jesus, let's just read it one more time, all the way through. 7 verses. For it is not to angels that he has subjected the inhabited earth to come, about which we are speaking. But a certain witness, Psalm 8, that's what he's referring to, has given proof somewhere, saying, what is man, that you keep him in mind, or the son of man, that you take care of him? Verse 7, you made him a little lower than angels or gods. With glory and honor you crowned him, and appointed him over the works of your hands. And then he says in verse 8, all things you subjected under his feet, finishing the quotation from Psalm 8. And then he says, look, for in that he subjected all things to him, to man, right? That's the subject to this point. The man that God made lower than the angels in Psalm 8. For in that he subjected all things to him, to man, God left nothing that is not subject to him. Just like we partially read in that context of Psalm 8, in the quotation. Now, though, we do not yet see all things in subjection to him, like we were made to have it. Verse 9, but we behold Jesus, who has been made a little lower than angels, gods. Hebrew text. Crowned with glory and honor for having suffered death, yet he by God's undeserved kindness, might taste death for every man, for it was fitting for the one for whose sake all things are, and through whom all things are, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the chief agent of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For he who is sanctifying and those who are being sanctified are all out of one. And for this cause he is not ashamed to call them brothers. All right. So it's very clear, is it not, that in Psalm 8, and in the application here in the first part of our reading in Hebrews 2, 5 through 8, that God made humans lower than angels. Gods. Same thing. In the sense in which Jesus also refers to the sons of God as gods, even though, of course, they're condemned in the sense that Psalm 82 speaks of them as gods. The sons of God who aren't condemned are referred to as God, gods, and more appropriately as God, in that they are God to others for him, like we've been talking about in our text reading on Exodus 7, and which we referenced earlier in this video. But nevertheless, in this case, a comparison is being made between the way God made humans lower than angels, gods, spirits, and Jesus being made lower than angels, gods, spirits. That's the same thing John is talking about in John 1:14, the Word becoming flesh. That's the same thing Paul is talking about in Philippians 2:6-9, when he talks about Jesus being in the form of a God and taking on the form of a man, emptying himself. That's what this is talking about. It's talking about God making him lower than the angels as a man, which he was not before, because he was an angel like them, a spirit, or Michael, right? Or we'll just say a spirit. Although I think it's pretty clear, if you read the New Testament and Old, Jesus is one of those angelic spirits. The angel of Jehovah, Michael the archangel, or one of the other angels, serving in the role before he became a man and was raised to the right hand of the Father and put on his throne. He became lower than that. The Word was in the beginning with God and was a God and became flesh. He was in the form of a God and took on the form of a man, emptied himself. The application of Hebrews 2, of Psalm 8, first to man, then to Jesus, to show what? The same thing. That he became a man. Not a God-man. He didn't continue being God. Not according to these texts. These texts are in direct conflict with the teaching of the Trinity, that Jesus never stopped being God, even when he was a man. These texts in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews explicitly teach he became lower than the angels when he became a man. And as a man, lower than the angels, he suffered and was perfected by his God to pay the ransom as the seed foretold, the Messiah, the one from of old, and whose origins are from of old, right? Micah 5. But who was then raised to life to the right hand of the Father, given the name above every name, not for his own glory, but to the glory of the Father, the one who made him lower than the angels, so that what? So that he could pay the price and taste suffering for everyone. And God then made him perfect through his sufferings so that he could be something to everyone. What? Says right there, does it not? So that he could be brothers to them, right? So that he could be made perfect through sufferings and be their brother in that respect, right? Having tasted death, having suffered like a human. None of the angels did that. None of the angels in their angelic materializations of the Old Testament suffered, right? Can you think of one? No, they didn't suffer or die, let alone die, right? They didn't become humans. They didn't become the Son of Man. They were not made lower than they already are by becoming a man. Jesus did. Hebrews 2 is telling us and teaching us, by applying Psalm 8 to Jesus, the exact same thing that John tells us in John 1:14, the Word became flesh. Not divine flesh, not God, not a God-man, became flesh. Paul tells us explicitly, like we'll talk about in a few shows from now, and like I've talked about already in my writings, he explicitly teaches that Jesus existed in the form of a God, just like John 1:1 says, and emptied himself by taking the form of a man. It doesn't say he retained the form of a God or God and added the form of a man to the form of God or a God. And that would make him more than a man. And at least equal to angels, right? If he was a God in the sense that they were in some respect. But if God, then surely, as Trinitarians teach, he's not lower than the angels. This text could not apply to him. If he was still God and never ceased to be God, he was not lower than the angels. Just because, even if we grant that he had another nature, which we know the texts do not teach, and which is in conflict with all God-given logic and reasoning. It's only used to support the Trinity, which came about hundreds of years later, as we'll get to later in this series, more detail. It's not possible for him to be rich if he's poor. And that's what Paul elsewhere says, is it not? Although he was rich, he became poor. Well, if you still have all your money, you're not poor. If you still have the form of God, you're not lower than angels. You're not a man. This text wouldn't apply from Psalm 8. But it does apply because he did become a man and he was lower than the angels, gods, the sons of God, what he himself is. But when he became a man, he was lower than the other sons of God, the angels, because that's how humans were made, according to Psalm 8. The application that we just read that was made. Humans are lower than angels, gods, the spirit gods who are sons of God. Jesus was made lower than the angels, sons of God, spirits of God. That proves conclusively that the Trinity is in irreparable conflict with the Bible in its teaching that Jesus was not only man, but also fully God. And that is in direct contradiction to the application of Psalm 8, made by the author of Hebrews in chapter 2, verse 9.